Anyway, thank you very much for coming to people online at home. It's a real pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the year. This is a co-production with the Center for Caribbean Studies, and it's a real great pleasure, to introduce my colleague, Dr. Yairen Columbié, who's Assistant Professor of Latin American Studies and Intercultural Communication at Trinity College Dublin, although not for much longer. We'll talk about that after. She's the author of the monograph Transculturation in Catalan-Cuban Intellectual History, which is fantastic. She's the co-editor of Creating Resilient Futures, Integrating Disaster Risk Reduction, Sustainable Development Goals, and Climate Change Adaptation Agendas. And she's also a poet and preferred poet. Her first collection was, apparently Mary doesn't like poetry. Her first collection was published last year. Her talk today, Hurricane Culture, Current Eco-Poetics, Relations Beyond the Hispanic Caribbean. Please join me in welcoming Yairen.
Thank you very much, both for the very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. Thank you to the two centers, to Conrad, and to the patrons of the center, Aphrodite and Haley, for all the help and for the welcome. Today, I'm going to talk about hurricane culture, a concept that and a set of practices that I link to an eco-poetics of relations beyond the Hispanic Caribbean. And first, I'm going to be I'm trying to move this, and it's not moving. Oh. I'm going to locate and outline the concept of hurricane culture. Then I'll be focusing on a case study by Teresita Fernández, a multidisciplinary artist based in New York, Caribbean, Cuban-American multidisciplinary artist. And finally, I'll be exploring with your help, hopefully, how we could contribute to that hurricane culture, how we can co-create that hurricane culture. So I propose the concept of hurricane culture to understand the diverse forms of environmental knowledge that emerge from a region that has been dealing with disasters and resisting the exploitation of both people and the environment throughout centuries. You have a depiction of the hurricane belt on the image, a region that encompasses the Caribbean and an important part of both the Pacific and the Atlantic coasts of the Americas. This wide regional focus invites us to look beyond colonially imposed and post-colonially shaped national borders, to pay attention to the forms of translocal solidarity that emerge from diverse subalpine communities across the Americas, and of course to the work of Latin American and Caribbean diasporas in North America. I argue that hurricane culture can help us to understand and put in practice an eco-poetics of relations, to voice out, understand, replicate, and connect the diverse forms of environmental knowledge and resistance practices that emerge from these communities. Of course, the idea of an eco-poetics of relations builds on Édouard Glissant's concept of eco-poetics of relations, relations between territories, between peoples, cultures, to articulate the relational quality of the post-colonial world from an ecocritical perspective. And I understand the criticism as a way of looking at nature and not in a contemplative manner, but in a transformative manner, perhaps, and embedding our knowledge within nature, not like this extreme subjectivity. I proposed the concept of hurricane culture in a book that will be published next year. In this new monograph, I draw upon my work on the Catalan-Cuban community, which was the focus of my first monograph. Thank you both for mentioning that, to study how Catalan-Cuban Jesuit priest Benito Viñes, how his first ever scientific text on hurricanes, and also Catalan-Cuban intellectual Fernando Ortiz's anthropological studies of indigenous cultural representations of storms inform this concept of hurricane culture and a continuum of hurricane culture. This allows me to undertake a diachronic, comparative, and critical analysis of the evolution of colonial and post-colonial environmental thought vis-a-vis ongoing decolonizing knowledge production and transformative actions by indigenous practitioners and also by Latinx practitioners. And I'll focus today in one of them, which is who is Teresita Fernández. But I'm also working with the poetry and the transmedia interventions and poets from Soque communities and other minorized communities and minority communities in Mexico, like Miguel Sanchez, Uber Matigua, Irma Pineda, who self-translated their poetry into Spanish, but whose work also go way beyond poetry, I would say. So going back to Teresita Fernández, in January 2021, the 3 wind-battered palm trees occupy New York City space, and you have them in English. The 3 wind-resistant bronze palm trees were part of Teresita Fernández's exhibition Maelstrom between November 2020 and January 2021 in the Lehman Malkin Gallery in New York. The exhibition centerpiece was placed in the High Line, the elevated linear park and greenway created on a previously abandoned New York Central Railroad spur on the west side of Manhattan. Now, drawn from the tropics' catastrophic presence of disasters accelerated by global warming, the bronze palm trees brought to New York's High Line the dystopian feel that often inspires creators imagining possible futures from the north, where the impacts of climate change are, let's say, less tangible than in the tropics, or tangible in a different way. The 3 wind-battered palm trees from Maelstrom referenced the present-day reality of devastating storms in the Atlantic. It is important to recall that in 2017, the Caribbean experienced one of the deadliest hurricane seasons of contemporary history, with 17 named storms, of which 10 became hurricanes, including Katia, Jose, Irma, and Maria, which unleashed humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico and ongoing humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico. Although with a lower number of storms, the 2022 hurricane season proved that major formations like Ian and Fiona pose severe threats to the region and to the hurricane belt. Teresita Fernández's sculptures stood in stark contrast to disengaged billboard and print depictions of the Caribbean, in which palm trees feature prominently as key components of idyllic landscapes and purchasable holiday experiences. By locating these storm-battered bronze palm trees in 30th Street and 10th Avenue in Manhattan, at only a few meters from important corporate offices, which I won't publicize, but it can be easily found on Google Maps. Maelstrom was also signifying the palm tree as a symbol of resistance against the global backdrop of socio-environmental violence and commodification of colonial and post-colonial terms. An omnipresent couple in the Caribbean imaginary, the hurricane and the palm tree enabled the artist to partially reenact a tropical disaster in New York. This intervention of the US space is an example of decolonizing hurricane culture action, which contests, destabilizes, and aims to uproot colonially shaped stereotypes about subaltern territories while calling attention to the coloniality of disasters to understand, and I quote Yairen Bonilla, how catastrophic events like hurricanes, earthquakes, but also other forms of political and economic crisis deepen the fault lines of long-existing racial and colonial histories. End of quote. In the same line, drawing upon research on environmental colonialism, disaster capitalism, and environmental history, Daniela Soy Rivera has proposed the concept of disaster colonialism to describe the role disasters play in perpetuating the colonization of Caribbean nations and states. Daniela Soy Rivera proposes the concept of disaster colonialism, or colonialismo desastre, to recognize continuously poor disaster planning, pre-planning, and response as a mechanism of deepening coloniality. And I quote, disaster colonialism examines the specific procedural mechanisms used to leverage disasters for the purposes of deepening colonization and coloniality. And she adds that disaster colonialism does not refer metaphorically to the phenomenon of colonialism, but instead it refers to real structural oppression operating through institutional inaction or poor responses. It's with these ideas in mind that I propose the concept of hurricane culture, and I argue that hurricane culture or huracán culture can contribute to the colonization not only of knowledge and the curricula, but also of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. By integrating the knowledge of local actors and subaltern communities, but also subaltern disciplines in environmental studies, the arts and the humanities, and creative practice. I argue that it's important to integrate these into responses, global responses to environmental challenges, and that hurricane culture can help us to do so. We need to bear in mind that cultural representations and participatory art activism can lead and have already led to changes in policy and laws. And we have the specific cases of Colombia and Ecuador, where cultural representations, art activism, and political pressure by groups that in some cases even include children, have actually operated change in laws in favor of the rights of nature, in favor of the rights of the Amazon rainforest, and in favor of the Atlantic River. And those are only examples. Now, just a brief parenthesis, in case you're not familiar with the work of New York-based Cuban-American artist Teresita Fernández. She was a MacArthur Foundation Fellow in 2005, and she's the recipient of numerous awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship. And in 2011, she was the first Latina to ever served in the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, which advises the President and Congress on national matters of design and aesthetics. And this gives us perhaps an idea of the impact her work can have, so beyond galleries and beyond the Hispanic Caribbean. This image shows another of her pieces, a recreation in glazed ceramics of a satellite image of tropical storms, actually of 3 of those tropical storms that affected the Caribbean in 2017. Katia, Irma, and tropical storm Jose, which would become a hurricane in September 8, 2017. And here we have the satellite image. Now, the pieces of Maelstrom, exhibited by the Lima Melting Gallery between November 2020 and January 2021, included a series of mixed media paintings, installations, and monumental sculptures in which palm trees feature prominently. We have another example in the image. And when revisiting the exhibition and writing about it, I had to ask myself, why palm trees? And it was not a short answer. The first obvious idea was that, of course, palm trees are a very central element in Caribbean landscapes. You know, the person who grew up in Cuba, of course, palm trees are everywhere. But there was more to it. And please allow me to dedicate a few minutes to unpack what I think is a very complex and rich relationship between the palm tree and the hurricane. First, there is a biological evolutionary relation. To survive in hurricane-prone areas, palm trees have developed a flexible trunk that allows them to resist strong winds through the recoverable deformation of their bodies. Instead of branches, they have a canopy of leaves that act almost as feathers and allows them to bend and shed water and to move in the direction of the wind. Now, it's perhaps because of this adaptability and resistance of the palm tree that they have been used with very different associations or cultures. For instance, in Greek mythology, the palm tree, the date palm tree in particular, is linked to the phoenix, the bird that cannot die, that's the birds. And Christian cultures assimilated this symbolism, taking the palm as an emblem of martyrs' victory over death. Now, poet José María Heredia used palm trees as a symbol of Cuba while praising Niagara Falls in 1824. And the stanza of this canonical poem, where he recalls the palm trees, which will become a national symbol, included in the Cuban emblem in 1902, discloses the poetics of exile and longing within Heredia's celebration of the waterfall. And allow me to, read in Spanish these verses. Mas que en ti busca mi anhelante vista, con inútil afán, ¿por qué no miro alrededor de tu caverna inmensa las palmas? Ay, las palmas, que en las llanuras de mi ardiente patria nacen, continúa el poema. And there's a lot to say about this poem. I'm going to focus on this in particular, but I think that it was important to bring it to illustrate how the symbolic resonance of the palm tree has reached even Canada and Niagara Falls. No, it's here too. It's part of this environment. So, no?
Translated by one of our former professors.
Another very well-known poem that opens with the palm tree is Verso Sencillo de José Martí, the verses by José Martí. Quite popular also because this stanza has been included in the song La Guantanamera, which is internationally known. So José Martí also focused on the palm tree, and then Joséito Fernández made it even more popular with La Guantanamera. And there's even a song by Cindo Garay, first part of the 20th century, titled El Huracán y la Palma. It's a beautiful song that you can find in his Antología, so it's very easy to find. And I analyzed the lyrics and the performance of this song as part of this continuum of art and culture. It's a great example. So Andrea Aureli has highlighted that following the tradition established by Heredia and Martí, the palm tree is also a constant and sometimes painful reminder of Cuba's natural beauty for migrants and exiles. This romanticized symbol features prominently and with diverse meanings in the work of artists from the Cuban diaspora to enunciate the experience of displacement, to represent national cohesion, and also with sacred connotations. In contrast to romanticized depictions of palm trees, both artists and environmental thinkers have also engaged with the problem of the oil palm monoculture, the negative impact of sterile seeds and the terminator gene, a specific genetic sequence inserted into a seed's DNA that renders the seed and the problem produces sterile. And I brought this book here for you as a reference in case you're interested in looking into it. Some of the pieces that I will discuss next show that convergence between Teresita Fernández's work and the type of ecofeminist thought of Vandana Shiva, who has denounced how, and I quote, colonization of the seed reflects the patterns of colonization of women's bodies. Profits and power become intimately linked to invasion into all biological organisms. However, despite associations of the oil palm monoculture with environmental degradation, palm trees continue to symbolize prosperity, fertility, and serenity across cultures. Whereas 20th and 21st century advertising has exploited these connotations to pin messages of luxury and holiday in the tropics, contemporary artists, such as Teresita Fernández, continue to face us with the contradictions inherent to the uses of the palm tree. As highlighted by Giovanni Aloy, who has written widely on the place of plants in art, very few non-humans have been burdened by symbolism and its cultural blindness like trees. Classical anthropomorphic symbolism makes us look at plants just to continue to discourse about human experience. And I quote, It relentlessly reduces trees to transcendental manifestations of human drives, relentlessly denying the chance to explore through art what plant being might entail. I think that with its models of palm trees transplanted directly from Caribbean reality during a storm and removed from symbolic appropriations in advertising and media, Teresita Fernández exploits the possibility to use art as a tool to rethink our relationship with plants and with others within the environment. Her sculptures do not merely symbolize resilience in front of storms. Instead, they are direct representations of the palm trees of the Caribbean, which suffer and resist environmental degradation, commodification, and also symbolic appropriation. There are more than 2,000 different species of palm trees in the world, and they are highly diverse in height and green. But the storm-battered bronze palm trees in Teresita Fernández's work resemble two of the most abundant species in the Caribbean, the royal palm and the coconut palm. Native to South Florida and Cuba, the royal palm is a large tree that quickly grows to heights of 15 to 20 meters, it can even reach 30 meters. It has a smooth green region above the trunk that is called the crown shaft, la corona. Whereas the royal palm is more commonly seen in inland valleys and even mountains, the coconut palm is a hallmark of tropical beaches. It is widespread throughout the tropics, typically being found along sandy shorelines. Coconuts, the coconut palm tree fruit, can float for long distances and germinate to form new trees after being washed ashore. Gravity, winds, even storms support the reproduction of coconuts and of the coconut palm. Reproduction, as we have seen already, is an important environmental topic. Now, coconuts embody these eco-poetics of relations, traversing the hurricane belt by burying drinkable water and nutrients, including minerals and protein, across the Caribbean archipelago and beyond. So I invite you to take a second to praise the life-supporting beauty of the coconuts. And I've even considered to write an entire chapter on the coconuts and how the coconuts embodies these eco-poetics of relation. I haven't done that, so it's open there. So all this to say that both the royal and the coconut palm are omnipresent in the landscapes and the cultural practices of a significant part of the hurricane belt. Not only because of their potential for allegory, but also as sources of shelter and food, which connects them centrally to religious practices. Now, for instance, the leaves of different types of palm trees have been used in the Caribbean to build the techos de guano, the guano groups from before colonization and in the present, they're still used. And the palmiche is central for pig farming in the several Caribbean countries. And now the interviews carried out by Lidia Cabrera with Afro-descendants in Cuba for the book El Monte, first published in 1951, show the important role of the palm tree in Afro-Caribbean spirituality. The book contains an entire chapter dedicated to the royal palm and its relations with the orishas or deities Shango, Oya, Agayu, Ogun, and Sasi, as well as its ritual and medicinal works. Published in Cuba in 1954, it was actually the first English edition is from this year by Duke University Press, which I think corroborates that this foundational book is still of interest. I would say that it's great material for teaching other ways of being in the environment, or embodied ways of being part of the environment. This book is also part of this hurricane culture somehow. Now, according to Afro-Caribbean beliefs, Shango, the ruler of fire, thunder, and lightning, and one of the major orishas, lives in the crown of the royal palm tree. If Shango is the ruler of thunder and lightning, one might say that the king of kings, as it's called in the Afro-Caribbean pantheon, who resides on the crown of the palm tree, is also somehow the orisha of hurricanes, the orisha of storms. Now, it is important to mention that Shango is associated also with fertility, with resistance, with war. And that Huracan, the Taino, the indigenous Taino word, refers to the god of storms and is also associated with Huabansex and with Atabey, the goddess of chaos, extreme weather, and fertility. So it all comes back to us in a circle somehow. Where am I going with all of this? Well, the same as the hurricane and the palm tree, which again are this omnipresent couple in the Caribbean cultural religious and environmental imaginaries. The pair formed by hurricane and culture tells a story of devastation and resistance, with a focus on life-supporting ecosystems, bodies, deities, and stories that bring together the human, non-human, and more than human worlds. Another example of this can be found in Teresita Fernández's installation named Huracan, an image here, which referenced the systemic exploitation of women's bodies in the Caribbean. The walls of the gallery, as you can see, were covered with hand-drawn horizontal lines, racing and falling, representing water tables or tides. At the center, the wall sculpture Archipelago, cervix, reconstructed the Caribbean islands as a conjoined circular unit. And if you look closer, you can identify some islands. For me, it's very easy to identify Cuba. They're looking like a lizard, but And the 20 pieces of Huracan were located along a single line surrounding the viewer. And the works depicted colorful abstractions suggesting aerial weather patterns and island-shaped embryos. In this piece, Teresita Fernández draws a parallel between the female names of hurricanes and eugenicist practices on Puerto Rican women's bodies. Atlantic hurricanes were initially named after the particular saint's day on which they occurred. However, Australian meteorologist Clement Bragg began giving women's names to tropical storms in the 19th century, and this practice gained more relevance in 1953, when scientists in the United States started naming hurricanes solely after them. This trend came to an end in 1979 in the Atlantic. And today, the World Meteorological Organization Tropical Cyclone Program regulates the use of both men's and women's or female names for storms. Now, the abandoned practice of naming destructive weather events exclusively after women connects centrally with the enduring misrepresentation of women in patriarchal societies, cultures, and knowledge-making systems. According to the text of the exhibition's press release, in Huracan, Teresita Fernández makes pointed reference to both the use of women's names for catastrophic weather events and the violent history of Puerto Rican women who were unknowingly used to test and develop the birth control field as part of the project led by Margaret Sanger from the 1940s to the 1960s, and the test took place in the 1950s in Puerto Rico. Described by Iris Lopez as a conservative feminist eugenicist, Margaret Sanger participated in the testing of the birth control pill in Puerto Rican women, funded by the US suffragist Catherine Dexter McCormick. Teresita Fernández's installation, Huracan, brings together and criticizes two misogynistic practices supported by institutions and governments. Exclusive female hurricane naming performed mainly by men of science, and contraceptive experimentation led by a female scientist and a suffragist, all guided by prejudice. Therefore, an analysis of the pieces calls not only for feminist perspectives, I would say that they call for intersectional ecofeminist perspectives. Huracan connects centrally with intersectional ecofeminist approaches that add nuance to existing critiques of colonialism and its consequences through the embodied experiences of women. These perspectives are well deployed by Laura Briggs in her study, of the violence exerted on Puerto Rican women's bodies and the role of colonial ideas on family, reproduction, and sexuality, as well as institutionalized racial prejudice in perpetuating injustice and inequalities. The field trials carried out in Puerto Rico in the 1950s connect centrally with the extended use of sterilization in both the island and among Puerto Rican women in the US throughout the 20th century. the use of both women's bodies and names to manage population and classify both nature and people as integral components of the environment, exemplify the epistemic coherence of colonial campaigns which affected and continue to shape the lives and territories of hurricane belts. By focusing on some of the most vulnerable bodies and names of the region, Teresita Fernández's installation, Huracán, denounces the destructive consistency of colonialism, which has operated through the use and abuse of nature, including people, in pursuit of a universe, this idea of progress, order, what family should be, and so on. Now, to conclude on a positive note, it would be important to highlight that people in the hurricane belt continue resisting and co-creating this hurricane culture through both their daily and creative practices. Now, I have been thinking about the concept of co-creating. It's not a concept that I coined. The creating or the creation concept is out there. It's a collaborative concept in itself. That's something I'm thinking about, and maybe we can discuss if it's appropriate here. Now, a relevant example of leadership in articulating opportunities for co-creation or co-creation of hurricane culture can be found in the work of indigenous poets, and I mentioned some of them earlier. And I just wanted to bring this example very briefly by poet Lucayan Sanchez, who is a Soke poet and activist playing a very important role in the organization called Indigenous Soke Faith-Based Movement in Defense of Life and Earth, so the for its Spanish initials. And this organization is challenging multiple extractive industries, from fracking to hydroelectric drums to natural gas drilling. Now, Lucayan Sanchez intentionally leaves many indigenous words untranslated in her work. She self-translated poetry, but she also works with a translator in English. And I brought these verses, I think, illustrates her contribution to the topic of hurricane culture. Niña no deseada, aquella que sacude el viento mientras sueña, ni cae espiritual, she cae espíritu tormenta. This association of storms with deities and also with radical figures, it's quite common across the hurricane belt, and it's something I'm very interested in exploring, because I think it allows to rethink hurricanes not only as destructive, the objectively destructive phenomena they are, but also as cultural metaphors to propose positive radical change, which is much needed, not only in the Caribbean, but globally. So I think that that's something that I would like to further study. If we have another 5 minutes, I would like to read a poem.
I think you can give you another 5 minutes.
Okay. So those would be my conclusions, and a poem. Bob mentioned that I write poetry myself, and again, I mean, I'm bringing this poem with humility, but thinking also that sometimes we are very shy about showcasing or presenting or sharing the creative side of our work. And I suppose that if what we are pursuing is radical change through hurricane culture, through what we do in academia, I suppose that sometimes a little radical act can be to read a poem at the end of an academic presentation. So I'm going to do so. I'll highlight that the beautiful translation, which I prefer, the original poem, is by Matthew Gibbon, Kinsale-based poet, whose poetry I really recommend. His last book is titled The Cloud Architect. So I'll stand because I'm not able to read still. Okay, and that will be it then. That's it. So this poem is titled Espejo. And maybe it's also the way, a way of reading and seeing her as an experiencing them. Espejo. Antes de caer y hacerse un ovillo, el arrecife tiene dos caras, como hoja de yagú, envoltorio y contenido, negativo y positivo de la imagen, verde y gris. Una mirada toda pencas, cielo, alguna nube sobre una capa de plata. Una mirada toda agujeros, poros, canales sobre una plancha de vidrio. Huracán también mira de lejos, con su único ojo. A veces suspira, se aleja. Huracán brama, irrumpe, baila en su templo con los brazos abiertos, ese ritmo y cuchillas. Las esponjas de mar licuadas espesan la danza de aletas, pólipos, partículas. Se vuelven células buscándose a tientas en la ronda para recomponerse. Todos giran, largan, se montan, escupen, se tocan, transmiten, convulsionan. Allá de caja, bombo, tons, goliath, plato, crash, right, hi-hat. Se parten las paquetas. Se revientan las cuerdas del violín, se rompe el vidrio, hierve la plata sobre los corales. Arrancados de cuajo por el viento y las olas, los animales flotan a la deriva. Los animales flotan a la deriva, arrancados de cuajo por el viento y las olas. Se rompe el vidrio, hierve la plata sobre los corales. Se parten las baquetas, se revientan las cuerdas del violín. Allá de caja, bombo, toms, goliath, plato, crash, right, hi-hat, todos giran, ladran, se montan, escupen, se tocan, transmiten, convulsionan, se vuelven células, buscándose a tientas en la ronda para recomponerse. Las esponjas de mar licuadas espesan la danza de aletas, pólipos, partículas. Huracán brama, irrumpe, baila en su templo con los brazos abiertos, ese ritmo y cuchillas. Huracán también mira de lejos con su único ojo. A veces suspira, se aleja. Una mirada toda de agujeros, poros, canales sobre una plancha de vidrio. Una mirada toda pencas, cielo, alguna nube sobre una capa de plata. Envoltorio y contenido, negativo y positivo de la imagen, verde y gris. El arrecife tiene dos caras como hoja de yagruma antes de caer y hacerse un ovillo. And I'll read it in English and apologize for mispronunciation. Before falling and curling up, the reef is two-faced like a yagruma leaf, wrapping and what's inside, negative and positive image, green and gray. A look all leaves, skies, on cloud, on a layer of silver. A look of poles, pores, channels on a glass plate. Hurricane watches from afar with its one eye, sometimes sight, walks away. Hurricane roars, bursts, dances on his temple with open arms, rhythm, blades. Liquefies his sponges thicken, the dance of fins, polyps, particles. They become cells reaching to recompose each other in the round, all turn, beat, write, speak, touch, transmit, compose, to the jazz of snare, bass, drum, tones, goliath, cymbals, crash, ride, hi-hat. The drumsticks snap, violin strings break, glass shatter, silver boils of a coral, uprooted by wind and waves, animals drift. Animals drift, uprooted by winds and waves, glass shatter, silver boils of a coral. The drumsticks snap, violin strings break, to the jazz of snare, bass, drum, toms, goliath, cymbals, crash, ride, hi-hat, all turn, beat, ride, speed, touch, transmit, compose. They become cells reaching to recompose each other in the round. Liquefied sea sponges thicken the dance of fins, polyps, particles. Hurricane roars, bursts, dances in his temple with open arms, rhythm, blades. Hurricane watches from afar with one eye, sometimes sighs, walks away. A look, all holes, pores, channels on a glass plate. A look, all leaves, sky, sun cloud on a layer of silver. Wrapping and what's inside, negative and positive image, green and gray. The reef is two-faced, like a yagruma leaf, before falling and curling up. Thank you very much.
Yeah, again, thank you very, very much. And I really appreciate the book again. It reminds me of the Catalan, where we always finish with poetry reading at the end.
Yeah,
it's a great way. We've got some time for questions, comments, complaints. Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. The poem was absolutely beautiful. I just have a question regarding the use of scientific language. So you did you told us about the colonial uses of science and scientific language, but I wondered if there is a space within the Eco-Poetics relations, if there's a space for scientific language, and I'm thinking a little bit of like perhaps like reading sweetgrass. There's a bit of an enmeshment between indigenous relation with the non-human world and the scientific worldview. I wondered if you could see a possibility for that in Hurricane cultures or not.
I think so. I think so that I suppose it depends on, and thank you very much for this question. It's a great question. I would be inclined to think that, of course, and it depends on who are the persons contributing to this Hurricane culture. I mean, anyone can contribute. I suppose that from academia and from the classroom, it's important that we keep our eyes open to people, creators, practitioners who are contributing in this sense. I can think about a poet based in the UK, not from the Caribbean. It's not work. She doesn't work on the Caribbean context or imaginers, but who has this amazing poem who won the Jinko Prize titled "Mean," and the poem is a recreation of the scientific finding when they found in the ocean a Bible. Scientists open it and what happened to it, and of course it uses scientific language, and there are an increasing number of workshops, poetry workshops now, and how to use scientific language as prompts. And so I think that poets are doing all sorts of crazy experimentations. I know that Legna Rodriguez Iglesias plays, and I like to say plays because I think her poetry is very playful, always very serious too, with hurricanes. And there are several hurricanes in her poetry. Now, to what extent that will inform science, I don't know. But I think that there is an increasing number also of people working in STEM, in science, looking at poetry. And I have a colleague who works on energy, he's an engineer, and is looking at how poetry allows us to understand the evolution of energy in the Irish imaginary. And that's already a huge step, that we have an engineer going through a lot of, studying poetry, writing poetry, and reading lots of poetry to learn something about his field through creative practice. And I think that there's hope there. I don't know if my answer is satisfying. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. It's certainly given me a lot to think about. So I don't know if my question is fully formed, but I was thinking about the interesting way that you're kind of working through, and also with reference to some of the artwork, which I wasn't familiar with before, but working through this relationship between, say, the natural or scientific phenomena of the plants and the storms, and then these artistic and poetic production, right, the creation that happens around it. So I was thinking about sort of the kind of shock doctrine approach to that relationship between like nature and culture, right? With Naomi Klein's argument that in fact it's not just the storm, it's the colonialist context around it, or it's the infrastructures and the politics that fail to address the problem, or that actually take advantage of, let's say, a natural disaster to make things so much worse for a given population. So that kind of relationship between nature and culture that sort of takes us by surprise, or also intertwines nature and culture. So I was wondering if you sort of see in your project a similar type of intertwining, or perhaps a relationship between like that I guess, for lack of a better word, kind of negative role of the cultural sphere.
That's a very interesting question, and yes, totally. Very recently, I started working on a new project that is linked to this one, and in which I looked at both the Malay archipelago and the Caribbean archipelago. And I, of course, go back to the work of course, Antonio Benitez Rojos, who described both archipelagos as meta-archipelagos, and I'm thinking about this idea of an ecocritical form of thinking, and based on drawing upon Benito Viñes' work. And looking at the map of the world, I just realized that it's easier than I thought to articulate the relationship between the Malay archipelago and the Caribbean. It's not only historical cultural relationship linked to the Spanish, American, and US Philippine War of 1898. If we look at the map, and if we look at geophysics, we are connected by the tectonic plates. The tectonic plates and the hurricane belt and the seismic belt, what they call the ring of fire, are connected, because the ring of fire ends in the Caribbean, finishes there. So yeah, sometimes what's the problem with culture is that we live within colonial culture, and these borders and relations have been colonially shaped, and there's only that much we can see. I suppose that looking at nature and looking at the realities that are already there allows sometimes to see those relations. I think that is quite evident also in the Caribbean, where we are so disconnected. We are part of the same environment from Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Cuba, but we don't know each other. We don't even speak the same language. We speak colonially imposed languages that we've turned into something else. But yes, I don't know. It's a very complex question, very rich, and that I aim to address actually through projects. And yeah, thank you very much for that question. Thank you for having there. Yeah.
Conrad James.
Yairen, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. Let's find out how much thought in your project, the one you're doing or the one you're about to start, how much weight, what role you give the diasporic cultures, the diasporic hurricane culture. Think about hurricane culture, not just typical stories, but ideas about death associated with hurricanes, whatever. And particularly, I guess, with diasporic women. And what led me to think about that is we talked about the Puerto Rican women being used as guinea pigs, but they were also subject to forced sterilization for decades without even realizing it. And that happened around the same time that the kind of mass migration from the island to the north was kind of encouraged. So that's one. Then you think back to Hurricane Maria, when you have another moment of extreme death, and again, many women be forced out of the island, and how they combat that. What are the kind of strategies of resistance that they use, from that diaspora space? You think again about somewhere like the Dominican Republic, right? I don't know if you know this work by Belkis Ramirez, the Mar Interior, and it's basically women being forced from the Dominican Republic to Italy, so on, to La Trata, and kind of sex work, right? But the background of that, background in all of those installations are really stormy seas. And then you get the idea of how do these women kind of regroup from there to participate in a kind of regenerative culture despite being trapped. So I just wondered if you had thought about the diaspora specifically and women work with that.
Thank you very much, Conrad. That's a great question and very helpful. I started thinking about it after considering Teresita Fernández's work and the work also of Iris Lopez, who's worked on the experiences of women, particularly in New York, who were sterilized, Puerto Rican women sterilized in New York. And yes, maybe death has not been a dimension there, but it should be, and even ideas on ecocide, because it's there too. And now that the word ecocide is out there, and there are these there's this activism towards making it a crime, like genocide. maybe there are opportunities there to explore what other people are writing on the topics. And thank you very much for the recommendation of Benito Viñes' work. I was not familiar either with her work or the reality of women in the Republic. So thank you very much.
Hi, thank you. That was good. That was amazing. I really so provoking. I have I think pretty much comments really that come from what you've said. And so this morning I was thinking about this issue of crisis in the Caribbean as something that's fundamental to the nature of the region and its people. And if you say that crisis as part of the colonial project, I think that the main thing when we talk about the hurricanes in eco-poetics has to do with this absence of indigenous knowledge about how to deal with the hurricane and how we mostly have the word of it. We seem to not have preserved indigenous knowledges about how to deal with that. So I wonder, the first part, in some way, the question is how much in your work are you dealing with indigenous knowledges that deal with the hurricane, and understand the hurricane, and how much have you kept of that? I wouldn't say literature, but like those legacies of how, because I think that that's exactly what's actually provokes the crisis that we call the hurricane, and the hurricanes obviously as a hurricane culture is also mainly for us not only an environmental issue but a human issue, right? And then the other part about it, and with respect to what you talked about this issue of the coconut, and then when we mentioned the question of diaspora, the coconut itself is the diaspora. It's the best example of a spore, right? It travels, and then it goes directly to this question of movement. But then I'm also thinking about the Tempest itself, like Shakespeare, not Caliban, but Sycorax, and whether that is connected as well. And the reason why I talk about Sycorax is because adding to the conversation of the hurricane, question of magic, and that as an Afro-Cuban person who practices Orisha worship, any powers, I would say that it's Oya rather than Shango, the goddess of the hurricane. And then maybe that it's not, I'm not saying feminizes, but it gives more of an Afro-Caribbean feminist position to the hurricane and its presence and its effects, right? And yeah, I think that this is sort of the nugget of what my comment is. I think that it's the issue. I think that he had this question about what kind of scientific thing we use. I think going back to Glissant and capacity, poetry is probably the best way to deal with the crisis that the hurricane is and the cyclical returns. So that's kind of what I want to say.
Thank you very much. Very rich comments. And
I think problem.
thank you so much. We're both from Pava, and that's great. Thank you so much. And totally. I'll start from the last comment. Actually, thank you very much for mentioning Oya, and that you think that it will be closer. Yeah.
So the reason why I said Oya got it, so not just the wind, but the strong wind, the centella. The word is a pupulele. It's like it's just the goddess of the force of the wind itself. So he's definitely the goddess behind the rhythm of the hurricane.
Okay. And Oya is sometimes also associated to death, or
we could say that, but
okay.
Let's just start seeing it as the female counterpart, Shango.
Okay.
People say that Oya is Shango's wife, but really this is the female part of Shango. Right? People talk about the cemetery as Oya being the guardian of the door of the cemetery, but really Oya is the goddess of death and Oshun, right?
Okay.
But Oya is really the breath, is ether, is what we breathe. So in that's direct mention to wind, to the force, So I think that if you go, I can actually also supply you with particular texts that that you can have, you see that this is the guy that's no problem.
Oh, please, thank you very much. That would be very helpful. Because of course, I know very little about this particular, what the little I know is through El Monte and through readings of El Monte, but I would be very grateful. Yeah, thank you very much. That totally makes sense. The first question, actually, how much I'm dealing and engaging with indigenous knowledge. I'm engaging with indigenous knowledge directly but through the work of these poets, active poets like Miquea Sanchez or Irma Pineda. In the case of Irma Pineda, also through her erotic poetry, and also through the visual work that is part of the initiatives of the Editorial Pluralia in Mexico that edits mainly indigenous poets and in collaboration with artists. And although they do not focus directly on storms and hurricanes, what I found is that storms and hurricanes and deities related to storms and hurricanes are across their work. So I'm trying to learn from them. And again, thank you for mentioning poetry as a great methodology to understand the hurricane culture and the crisis, because I totally agree with that. And I'm also engaging with indigenous knowledge through Fernando Ortiz. Of course, this is more distant. There's more distance there because he studied artifacts, sometimes from a position of estrangements, and linking it to European cultures. His work on hurricanes and the indigenous cultures of the Caribbean is very rich and interesting. His book, El Huracán, su mitología y sus mitos, Hurricane and his mythology and history and mythology, it's very interesting. But I think that I need to engage with the ongoing practices of indigenous people. And another way in which I think we could all engage with indigenous knowledge, particularly in the case of Cuba, is through recent studies by the Smithsonian on the presence of Caribbean practices in El Oriente, in Guantanamo, and with all the cultural production around the Taino turn and the indigenous turn of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. And sometimes they don't come in the way of papers, but they come in the form, of photographic exhibitions or exhibitions of material culture, and I think that there's a lot there to explore. And again, also thank you very much for the comments on the coconuts. The coconuts are,
I think it's a chapter.
yeah, it is maybe a collaboration, and the cypress, yes, totally, yes.
Yeah, then I'm gonna use my position to ask you a question as well. How does the sort of now stereotypical or iconic God's eye view, right, of the image of a hurricane from the satellite image, how has that inflected our understanding of hurricanes? And what was the iconic visual representation for that? Because it's so powerful, and even in the poetry, the eye, like we talked with this, like the singular eye, right?
Well, thank you very much for that question. That connects with the previous question. Actually, the first known representations of hurricanes are from the indigenous cultures of the Caribbean, particularly from the Taino culture. And the hurricane, I read that meteorologists, when they got to see hurricanes, they were surprised of how accurate the representations of the indigenous people were. Hurricanes, they even captured the direction of the rotation of hurricane in the Atlantic, and these representations have a center.
Okay,
that is
so
exactly the eye. So this idea of the arms of the hurricane that we use there in scientific knowledge come from the Taino representations, because this Semi, the particular deity of the hurricane, was this bull with two arms. I don't know if that answers your question.
No,
That was
totally.
the first thing that came
Yeah.
to mind, and I forgot to mention, that hurricane culture could be a way also for the Caribbean to reconnect with its indigenous cultures, and from a position of proudly looking at how much those communities knew about their environment without satellite images, but they knew what they were talking about. They knew the phenomena, also how it looked. and that's amazing, that's, I don't know.
Yeah. Please join me in thanking you. Let me just briefly mention a couple of the things we've got coming up, both our events and co-sponsored events. Next Friday, we have Ilaria Porciani from the University of Bologna, who's going to be talking about foodways in Italy. On October 10th, we have George Lovell, who's going to be reading from his book, A Beauty That Hurts. It's about his experiences in Guatemala. And then the week of the 16th of October, we're co-sponsoring with Imran out in Scarborough. We have Oksana Timofeva coming, and then Michael Hart from the Heart of Angry Empire book. The Hart talk will be in the chapel. The Timofeva talk will be here. Also now we have time, we're gonna pop over to the pub on Bay Street. What's it called? The Firkin. So if anyone wants to come, first round's gonna be, but thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you.